Welcome to the Weaver Sews. I'm Daryl Lancaster. One of the things that my years of experience has taught me is that there is no one way of doing anything. Having the confidence to switch gears and come up with an alternative method when the way that you've always done something just isn't working is a huge asset in garment construction. There are many ways to do a task. Any task, and there are no absolutes. It all depends on the garment or fabric in front of you and what it needs. No two children are alike. I have two, and they couldn't be more different. And no two pieces of fabric are alike, especially hand-woven fabrics. They will behave very differently, even using the same garment pattern. So this flexibility is important, but hard to teach. Having a good pair of scissors to rip things out that aren't quite right is a good start. But recognizing that things aren't quite right and not being afraid to think it through and come up with plan B or C or D takes a lot more guts and confidence and experience, or maybe just guts. So that brings us to the final installment of the creation of these two jackets. All that's left is to put the lining into the Harris tweed. Both of these jackets were cut from my 200 jacket pattern. I am normally a size green. My sizing uses colors instead of numbers, and since I expected the hand-woven jacket to grow because it is hand-woven, I cut my normal green size, but I added one size up in the hips to the red size line because, well, quarantining for the last year allowed me to eat well, but be sedentary, and let's just say that my hips needed the next size up. I did a video on combining sizes where a dart in the side seam gets in the way, and both of these jackets have a dart in the side seam. The Harris tweed, a commercial wool, but certainly something I could easily have woven, will give, but not in the same way that a hand-woven fabric will. And I wanted this jacket to be more oversized, more of a boyfriend jacket look. So I just cut one size up, and in this case, my full red size. The hand-woven jacket has a neckband, and I added piping, which I interrupted to create button loops. Adding a lining to this jacket was pretty straightforward. I just inserted the lining and stitched the selvage edge of the band down over it. Part 2 of my video on inserting a lining explains this. But the Harris tweed version has a separate shawl collar band, which has an under collar and an upper collar, and has a substantial curve on the seam line that attaches to the jacket. So there is no selvage edge. In addition, the upper collar facing of this jacket is from Caviar Leather, something that's been lounging for far too long in my stash and wanted to be a part of this party. In addition, this collar band has bound buttonholes in it. So the easiest way of inserting the lining would have been either folding under the seam allowance of the collar facing at the jacket seam line and slipping the lining underneath, or finishing off the cut edge of that seam allowance with, say, a Hong Kong seam finish, and again, then slipping the lining underneath and hand stitching the upper collar facing down over it. Both methods are described in the jacket directions for the 200 jacket to keep things simple. However, there are two issues here that prevent either of those methods from working properly. And one is that the upper collar facing is made from leather, and hand stitching is pretty challenging with leather. The other, of course, as we have previously discussed, is that because of the bound buttonholes, any seam allowances that push into the collar band will interfere with the buttonhole opening. So, plan B. The easy solution is to install the lining in the traditional way all linings are installed, and that's by anchoring the upper collar facing to the body wall of the jacket, and then bringing the lining over it and hand stitching it down. And you can see how this works in this jacket. The lining seam allowance stays away from the buttonholes and all should be well. Except that, as we've already discussed, hand sewing anything to leather is challenging. And because the lining isn't attached at the bottom of the jacket to allow for growth and ease, the inside should be finished in a tidy way, at least the part that's visible. So, plan C. To avoid trying to hand sew the lining to the upper collar facing, which is leather, it makes sense to just directly machine stitch the two together before attaching the upper collar facing to the body wall of the jacket. That solves the problem of hand stitching, and I can finish off this seam once they're stitched together so it looks nice inside. But I've chosen to set the sleeves into the lining first instead of by hand later. So anchoring the lining under the arm like we did in the lining video part 2 will be a challenge, but not impossible. So let's start by attaching the outer perimeter of the lining to the collar facing piece. Again, my mantra, pin what you know, fits here. Find the tacks and match them up and make the rest fit. Remember that the lining sits 1/2 inch or 1.2 centimeters from the lower edge. And because of the bound buttonholes, I went ahead and anchored the windows that were cut into the facing part way to make sure that they lined up. Of course, because this is leather, I'll use my trusty clips instead. You can find these at wawac.com. Once the lining is clipped or pinned to the upper collar facing, start at the lower left and stitch the two together. To finish off the cutting line of the lining and upper collar facing, that raw edge there, I'll sew a piece of bias to the edge and make a Hong Kong seam finish. So up inside, the seam looks tidy and the exposed part of the facing will be finished. And I only have to go up as far as maybe the bust line because the rest of it will not be seen. By folding the bias underneath the facing, when you start sewing, you'll have a finished edge there as well. And now we have to mount the upper collar facing with the lining attached to it to the body of the jacket. Since the seam allowances were pressed open when we first attached the under collar band, there is something to actually anchor the upper collar facing seam allowances to. Now, I prefer to pin these together and checking that the collar rolls correctly and adjusting exactly where the two layers connect and hand baste them together all the way around. But I'm working with leather. So I'll have to get in there with a zipper foot and attach the two by machine. I'll use a machine basting stitch since this is just holding two layers together up inside the jacket. So I'll start stitching the two layers together about 2 inches from the lower edge, right on top of where the hem allowance starts. Once everything is steamed and pressed, the final step is to attach the lower edge of the facing as it rests on the hem allowance. To reduce bulk here, I actually clip the seam allowance from the jacket and under collar band seam, just the height of the hem allowance, so it can tuck inside the band. Give that a good steam. Typically in tailoring, when wool meets wool, this lovely catch stitch is used. Having the Hong Kong trim on the edge of the leather facing gives me something to grab into with the hand stitching because, you know, leather. So that leaves anchoring the underarm of the lining to the underarm of the jacket. This is where it is helpful to have experience wrestling alligators or children. Just kidding. This is a bit of a spatial challenge. Grab the sleeve lining and pull it towards you away from the jacket. Now, we lift the lower edge of the lining, which will remain unattached, and dig around up inside the jacket to expose the seam allowances of the lower portion of that armhole or arm's eye seam between the markings or dots. Match the underarm seam and the dots and make the rest fit smoothly. Remember, as demonstrated in the video lining part 2, we took a smaller seam allowance at the bottom of the lining armhole seam to allow the lining to move up and over the jacket sleeve seam allowance, which we did not trim because you don't trim hand-woven fabrics, especially in the sleeve area. That smaller seam allowance tapers up to the full 5/8 or 1.5 centimeter once the dots are reached. Now I'll baste these two together securely by hand. No sense trying to wrestle this whole jacket underneath the presser foot. Once finished and all the pins are removed, push the sleeve lining through the sleeve opening and down the sleeve. We folded the lower edge of the sleeve lining up 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters. We will use a slip stitch or fell stitch to anchor that fold to just below the binding. Once we hand stitch that fold to the upper edge of the jacket sleeve hem allowance, a light pressing will create the pleat at the lower edge of the sleeve, again to allow the wool to ease and give. We'll need to finish stitching the facing window to the back of the bound buttonhole. As you can see, it's still not completely attached. So I've left some thread here, and then I will hand sew and finish that all the way around and anchor that securely. The only step left is to attach the buttons and remove all the tailor's tacks. And there's a lot of them. And then I'll be able to wear this slightly oversized jacket out this afternoon on my walkabout town. Spring is here in New Jersey, and this is a perfect way to celebrate. I'm Daryl Lancaster for The Weaver Sews.